It was a humid summer evening in 1993 when 8-year-old Nathaniel Briggs vanished without a trace. The sun had set behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of suburban Houston. Cicadas chirped in the trees as porch lights flickered on, and families settled into their nightly routines. But at 8:37 p.m., Ann Briggs dialed 911 with trembling hands. Her voice cracked as she told the dispatcher, "My son never came home." Nathaniel had left his friend Jacob's house just before sunset. He was riding his bike, a red Schwinn with a white seat and a bell that he loved to ring for no reason. Jacob's mother watched him pedal off, waving goodbye. He had barely a 6-minute ride to reach home, all along quiet residential streets. But he never made it. The Briggs family, Ann, Eric, and their 3 children, had moved into the neighborhood 2 years earlier. They were quiet, but well-liked. Eric worked long hours as a project manager for an oil and gas company. Ann stayed home with the kids, volunteering at church and organizing school bake sales. Nathaniel, the middle child, was bright, sensitive, and loved drawing superheroes. That evening, Ann had been cooking dinner when she noticed the time. Nathaniel should have been back by now. She told herself not to panic. Maybe he had stopped to look at something. Maybe he ran into another friend. But 20 minutes became 30, and then an hour. Eric, who had just returned from work, drove the streets while Ann paced the living room, calling Jacob's house over and over. Jacob's mom confirmed what Ann feared. Nathaniel had left on time. No one had seen him since. By the time police arrived, darkness had fully settled in. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, questioning neighbors and checking parks and alleyways. A BOLO alert was issued. Volunteers joined the search. Flashlights swept the woods behind the cul-de-sac. Helicopters circled overhead. There were no screams, no signs of struggle. Nathaniel's bike wasn't found in a ditch or by a tree. It had simply vanished, just like him. If you're drawn in by stories like this, real-life mysteries that twist and unravel in the most unexpected ways, make sure to subscribe. We uncover the forgotten, the hidden, and the unresolved. By midnight, news crews had already arrived on scene. Reporters interviewed neighbors who said Nathaniel was polite, quiet, never the kind of kid to run off. One older man claimed he saw a red van speeding down Evergreen Street around the same time Nathaniel would have been passing through. He couldn't remember the plate or even the make, just that it didn't belong there. Ann couldn't sleep. She sat by the window the entire night, staring at the street. Eric stayed outside with the search team, his flashlight cutting through bushes and backyards. Every hour, he came back empty-handed. The next morning, local newspapers ran the headline, "Boy 8 missing in West Houston suburb." The Briggs house filled with people, police, reporters, church friends bringing casseroles and offering prayers. But Ann hardly spoke. She kept glancing toward the front door as if expecting Nathaniel to walk through it any minute, his shoes muddy, apologizing for being late. Her hands trembled constantly. Eric, on the other hand, remained stoic, focused. He took charge, spoke to the press, coordinated with investigators. But those close to them noticed cracks, small arguments, unspoken tension. Detectives found no clues, no tire marks, no footprints, no witnesses beyond the vague mention of a red van. Days turned into weeks. A massive reward was offered. Billboards went up. Flyers blanketed telephone poles and gas stations. Nathaniel's face, smiling, missing 2 front teeth, became a fixture across Houston. Ann refused to take down his drawings from the fridge. His backpack remained untouched in the hallway. At night, she would sit in his room, running her fingers over his pillow, whispering his name. Eric, meanwhile, began sleeping on the couch. When asked by friends how he was holding up, he would only say, "I'm focused on bringing him home." But home felt different now. Hollow. Every creak in the floorboards made Ann jump. Every child's voice in the distance made her turn her head. Neighbors, once supportive, began to retreat. Rumors began to swirl, not because of evidence, but because silence breeds suspicion. And still Nathaniel was gone. No one knew how, no one knew why. No one knew if he was alive, just that he had left on his bike, on a quiet Houston street, and disappeared forever. The morning after Nathaniel's disappearance, the Briggs front yard was crowded with search volunteers. Some brought dogs, Others handed out flyers. Police officers worked in shifts, fanning out block by block, checking drainage ditches, abandoned sheds, even trash bins. A command center was established at the community center 3 blocks away. Local businesses donated food and flashlights. Strangers who had never met the Briggs family showed up just to help. Detective Ronald Avery, a seasoned investigator from HPD's Missing Persons Unit, was assigned the case. He spoke calmly but directly during the first press conference, stating, "We are treating this as a high-priority missing child case. We are exploring every possibility." His tone was steady, but behind closed doors, Avery felt the pressure mounting. The statistics on child abductions were grim. If a child wasn't found within the first 48 hours, the chances of recovery dropped dramatically. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew over the neighborhood. Officers waded through nearby bayous, fearing the worst. Divers searched retention ponds. Still nothing. Not a shoe, not a shred of clothing, not even the red bike. The Briggs family cooperated fully. Eric gave multiple interviews, pleading for information. "Please, if you saw anything, even if you think it's small, call the police. Bring our boy home." His voice cracked slightly on boy, but he held himself together. Anne, however, seemed disconnected. She barely spoke to officers unless prompted. Her answers were short, sometimes vague. One detective noted in a report, "Mother appears emotionally detached, possibly shock or grief response." But others began to whisper. Anne insisted on being involved in the search, but often wandered off. A volunteer found her several blocks away, staring blankly at a storm drain. When asked what she was doing, she replied, "I thought I heard something." Later that day, she collapsed during a group search near the old railroad tracks. EMTs said it was exhaustion, but some weren't so sure. Neighbors began sharing theories. Some believed a predator had targeted the neighborhood. Others wondered about the red van reportedly seen by Mr. Sloan. Police canvassed nearby auto shops, combing through vehicle records. No matches, no suspicious vans in the area. The Briggs home became the center of the storm. Reporters parked along the curb. Cameramen stood across the street, capturing every movement. Anne eventually stopped leaving the house. She stopped answering the phone. She stopped answering her children's questions. Eric grew frustrated. He threw himself into the logistics of the search. He created a timeline of Nathaniel's last known movements. He mapped every reported sighting, but there were no concrete leads, no suspects, no evidence of abduction. It was as if Nathaniel had dissolved into the air. The lead detective met with Anne and Eric in private. He asked again if anything unusual had happened in the days before Nathaniel disappeared. Any arguments, strange visitors, tension at home? Anne shook her head. Eric hesitated, then admitted they had been under stress, citing finances and Anne's recent mood swings. Still, he insisted their marriage was solid. Anne didn't respond to that. She just stared at the wall behind the detective. Her silence left a void in the room. 2 weeks after Nathaniel vanished, a prayer vigil was held at the local park. Hundreds gathered, holding candles. The mayor spoke. So did the principal of Nathaniel's school. When Anne stepped up to the microphone, she froze. For a full 30 seconds, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "I miss him," and walked away. Behind closed doors, detectives debated their approach. The lack of evidence was confounding. No break-ins, no ransom, no motive. And yet, something felt off. Avery began to re-interview family members separately. He asked Anne about her day-to-day routine, but she became defensive. She said, "I already told you everything. I don't know what else you want from me." Eric, meanwhile, admitted he and Anne hadn't been on the same page for months. "She's not herself," he told Avery. "She sleeps all day, talks to herself sometimes, but she loves our kids. She wouldn't hurt them." Still, the question lingered. If no one from outside took Nathaniel, then who did? The search was now national. Nathaniel's face appeared on milk cartons, TV segments, and grocery store bulletin boards. Psychics called the hotline with visions. Truckers reported seeing boys who looked like him at gas stations across Texas. Every lead was investigated. None panned out. And while the world kept spinning, the Briggs household began to implode, quietly, invisibly. A family unraveling, one unspoken truth at a time. As summer turned into fall, the leads dried up. The search effort continued, but the urgency began to fade. People had to return to work, school resumed, and news cycles shifted. Nathaniel's face was still on billboards, but fewer eyes lingered. The Briggs family remained in a kind of suspended animation, stuck between hope and the quiet dread that no one voiced aloud. Detective Avery met with his team and went over the timeline again. "We're missing something," he said. They rechecked every house in a 5-block radius. They re-interviewed neighbors. They traced school bus routes, examined camera footage from nearby gas stations, checked in with parole offices and sex offender registries. Nothing. One detective, a young officer named Martinez, brought up a theory. What if the letters Mr. Briggs got weren't random? There had been 2 of them, anonymous notes slipped into their mailbox. One read, "You're being watched." The other said, "Ask your wife what really happened." Both had no fingerprints. At the time they were dismissed as cruel pranks. Now they took a closer look. Eric denied knowing who sent them. He admitted he hadn't shown them to Anne. She wasn't stable, he said. I didn't want to push her further. When pressed on her behavior, he described how she would sometimes walk into Nathaniel's room in the middle of the night and stand there, unmoving, for an hour or more. Anne, when asked, claimed not to have seen the letters, but her responses were uneven. "Someone is trying to poison us," she whispered once to a detective. Another time she said, "He's not gone. He's just hiding." Her words painted a picture of confusion, of denial, but not of guilt, or so it seemed. The support group she had joined for grieving parents noticed the inconsistencies too. At one meeting, Anne said Nathaniel had called out to her from the backyard the night he disappeared. At another, she insisted she had seen him in the hallway the next morning. Some members grew uncomfortable. A few distanced themselves entirely. Meanwhile, tensions at home escalated. Eric began spending nights at his brother's house. Their eldest daughter, Emily, only 10 at the time, started wetting the bed again. Their youngest, Max, was barely 4 and cried whenever Anne picked him up. The weight of silence pressed on the family like a storm cloud that never burst. Friends who had once dropped off casseroles stopped visiting. At school, Emily was teased by classmates who heard rumors. "Your mum killed your brother," one boy sneered. Emily punched him in the nose and was suspended. When the principal called home, Anne didn't answer. Detective Avery, frustrated, asked to have a psychologist evaluate Anne unofficially. The professional noted signs of dissociation, chronic sleep deprivation, and deep-rooted unresolved trauma, but nothing that could be tied to a crime. "She's fragmented," the report read, "but that's not evidence." Behind the scenes, the district attorney refused to press charges without hard proof. The media had moved on. Other stories, other missing kids, captured the nation's attention. Nathaniel's disappearance was slowly becoming a ghost story whispered at sleepovers. Eric found himself at a breaking point. One evening, after putting the younger kids to bed, he confronted Anne in the kitchen. "I need to know what happened," he said. "That night. Did something go wrong? Did you do something?" Anne stared at him, silent. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. Eric slammed his fist on the table. "Say something," Anne whispered. He was scared. "I didn't mean to scare him." "What does that mean?" he shouted. She didn't answer. Eric packed a bag and left that night. The next morning, he filed for temporary custody of the remaining children. He told detectives, "I can't protect them if I don't know what happened. And I don't know who I'm married to anymore." Despite everything, there was still no body, no confession, no forensic evidence. The red van had never resurfaced. And though suspicion hovered thick around Anne, there was nothing tangible the police could hold on to. Still, a question hung unspoken between every word, every glance, every night Anne spent alone in the house. If she wasn't responsible, why did she act like someone who was? Something had cracked. The case was still officially open, but hope was dwindling. And as winter approached, so did a silence that grew colder than anything the Houston air could deliver. In the stillness of those long months after Nathaniel disappeared, Anne Briggs began writing. It started with small notes on scraps of paper, phrases, images, fragments of thoughts she couldn't say aloud. Eventually, she found an old cloth-bound notebook at the back of her closet. Its pages were yellowed and stiff, the binding slightly torn. She took it without hesitation and started to write. At first, the entries were simple and brief. Can't sleep again. The air feels heavy. He used to hum when brushing his teeth. But over time, her writing became longer, more disjointed, laced with fear and confusion. She never titled the pages, never dated them. Sometimes she wrote in the middle of the night in darkness, using the kitchen table as her only lighted corner of the house. "I can still hear the bell on his bike," she wrote in one entry. "Even though I know it's gone, it rings in my head when I close my eyes." Anne never told anyone about the journal. Not Eric, not her therapist, not the officers who continued to check in periodically. The notebook was her private space, the only place she felt free to be honest, though even there, the truth struggled to break through. Some passages were cryptic, like, "He stood too close to the shed that day," or "There was something wrong with the fence. It shouldn't have been open." Others were more chilling in their ambiguity. "I tried to protect him, but I wasn't strong enough. I saw myself do it, but I don't remember how." There was no clear admission, but the entries hinted at something hidden, something buried beneath memory and denial. The pages were soaked in emotion, grief, guilt, fear. She described vivid dreams where Nathaniel came back, but not as a child. He was older, silent, with empty eyes, and he never forgave her. In one entry, she wrote, "He speaks without words. I think he's angry. I think he knows." Anne never reread what she wrote. She filled page after page, then folded the book into a plastic grocery bag, sealed it, and tucked it beneath a pile of blankets in the attic. The act gave her momentary peace, like she had locked something dangerous away. Meanwhile, she grew more withdrawn. Her interactions with others were minimal. She stopped answering calls from the support group. She no longer responded to messages from the detectives. She ignored her own parents when they reached out. Her world had shrunk to the size of that notebook and the memories it threatened to unearth. But the writing didn't stop. On nights when her hands trembled too much for a pen, she would whisper to herself, repeating certain phrases. "He never made it past the fence." "The bell, the bell." There was shouting, then nothing. Over and over, like a chant. The journal wasn't a record, it was a fracture. It revealed not a story, but a splintered mind trying to hold on. In one particularly fragmented passage, Anne wrote, "I see the door, but I don't open it. I hear the voice, but I don't turn around. I know what happened, but I also don't. Is that possible? Can someone forget and remember at the same time?" Despite her isolation, Anne kept up appearances when absolutely necessary. When Child Protective Services scheduled visits to assess custody for Emily and Max, she cleaned the house, made polite conversation, baked cookies. The officials noted that she seemed tired, distracted, but stable enough. Eric didn't fight her. He still didn't have proof, just fear. But inside, Anne was unraveling. The lines between memory and imagination blurred. The journal became darker, less coherent. "The shed was breathing," she wrote once. "The light wouldn't turn on. He was there. He asked me why." And still, there was no resolution. The police stopped checking in. The case sat cold. Anne continued her quiet spiral, convinced that Nathaniel wasn't gone but hidden, by her own mind or by something far worse. Then one night, she wrote a line unlike the others. "It was my hands. My voice. But I don't think it was me." She didn't write again for 2 weeks after that. When she returned to the journal, the next page simply said, "If anyone finds this, I'm sorry. I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to tell the truth." But the truth was still buried, and the pages were just beginning to whisper. By 2003, the 10-year anniversary of Nathaniel's disappearance arrived with little fanfare. A small vigil was held at the same park where hundreds once gathered, but only a handful attended. The news stations gave it a brief mention. Time had passed, and with it, the urgency. But online, interest in the case was beginning to stir again. The rise of internet forums and early true crime blogs gave Nathaniel's story a second life. People who had never heard of him stumbled onto archived news clips and grainy photos. Armchair detectives pored over public records, pieced together theories, and reopened debates long thought settled. Some threads were compassionate, desperate to find the boy or understand what had happened. Others turned dark. One theory that gained traction was that Anne had orchestrated the entire disappearance to punish Eric for an alleged affair. Another speculated about a satanic cult operating in the woods beyond the Briggs neighborhood, citing symbols found spray-painted on a tree during the 1993 search. Yet another claimed Nathaniel had been taken by human traffickers and seen in New Mexico years later. None of these theories were grounded in fact, but they spread quickly. Anne remained unaware of most of them. She didn't use the internet. She barely watched TV. But Emily, now a teenager, had started digging, quietly at night, on the family's old computer. She found the forums, the rumors, the accusations. She read the word murder next to her mother's name dozens of times. She never asked Anne about it. Instead, she began to withdraw. At school, classmates whispered. A few had seen the online posts. One girl handed Emily a printed forum comment, "She knows what happened." "Look in the shed." Emily crumpled the page and threw it in the trash, but the word stuck. Anne noticed Emily's distance but said nothing. She had grown used to silence. Eric, still legally married to Anne, had moved on in most ways. He lived separately, raised Max primarily on his own, and avoided interviews. When asked by a local reporter for a statement on the 10-year mark, he declined. "It's not something I want to revisit publicly," he said. Privately, though, he continued to believe something had gone terribly wrong that night, something Anne hadn't fully admitted, maybe even to herself. He had once searched the house from top to bottom, looking for clues. He never found the journal. It remained hidden, untouched in the attic. Back online, the case reached a new audience. A popular early YouTube creator featured Nathaniel in a top 5 unsolved disappearances video, garnering hundreds of thousands of views. People began contacting Houston PD with old tips, new suspicions, wild confessions. None led anywhere. But the pressure was enough that the department assigned a cold case detective to review the file. Detective Sharon Lindley, recently promoted, requested the old evidence boxes. She reviewed the original interviews, the photos, the witness reports. She noted the inconsistencies in Anne's statements, particularly about her whereabouts the evening Nathaniel vanished. She requested a new interview. Anne declined. Lindley didn't push. Not yet. Instead, she started interviewing others again. Neighbors, former volunteers, members of the old support group. Some remembered Anne's erratic behavior. Others defended her. But a pattern emerged, of confusion, detachment, and growing suspicion. One detail stuck out. Multiple people recalled Anne mentioning the shed during group meetings. One member, a woman named Patricia, claimed Anne once said, "He was afraid to go near it." Said it felt wrong. The shed had never been officially searched. It was small, unremarkable, just a storage space behind the house. Detectives in 1993 had knocked on it, peeked inside, found only tools and rusted garden equipment. It hadn't been considered relevant. Lindley made a note, but without a warrant or probable cause, there was nothing more she could do. The case remained cold. The trail for now stopped at Anne's silence and the internet's endless speculation. Still, questions hung in the air. Why hadn't the family moved? Why had Anne never attempted a public plea again? Why did Eric remain so careful with his words? More importantly, what was it about that shed? Because online, buried among all the wild theories and unproven claims, was a phrase that kept appearing again and again. He never made it past the fence. The same phrase Anne had once whispered to herself in the dark. In the spring of 2008, Anne Briggs collapsed in her kitchen. Emily, now 20 and home from college for a weekend visit, found her unconscious beside the fridge. The paramedics said it was likely a combination of dehydration, malnutrition, and stress. Anne had grown thinner over the years, her skin almost translucent, her speech slower, her presence ghost-like. At the hospital, doctors discovered dangerously low blood pressure, signs of vitamin deficiency, and elevated cortisol levels. They kept her for observation. Emily stayed by her side for the first night, but on the second she returned home, alone in the house she hadn't truly lived in for years. It felt frozen in time. Nathaniel's room was untouched, preserved like a shrine. The same drawings on the walls, the same books on the shelf. In the attic, searching for clean blankets, Emily opened a dusty plastic bin and found the journal. She didn't recognize it at first. The cover was faded, stained in places, but as she flipped through the pages, a chill passed through her. Her mother's handwriting, dozens of entries, some long, others just a single line. None of them titled, none of them coherent in the way a diary should be, but they spoke. Emily read through the night. At first, confusion, then unease, then outright dread. The early pages spoke of pain, grief, guilt, but deeper in the tone changed. The entries became darker, the language more fractured. He wouldn't stop crying. The fence was open. It was never supposed to be. I screamed, but I didn't mean to. Then came a phrase Emily would never forget. He never made it past the fence. The same line that had echoed across online forums, that strangers had speculated about for years. Her mother had written it long before the internet picked it up. She kept reading. I buried the truth. I buried it all. It was supposed to be a moment. But it became a lifetime. There was blood on the handle. Emily's breath caught. Her hands trembled. The next entry was short, barely legible. I didn't mean to. I told him to stop. He fell. I froze. I made it worse. It wasn't a confession in the legal sense, but it was something more damning, an emotional unraveling in real time, a record of guilt, of action, of concealment. Emily didn't know what to do. The next day she visited Anne in the hospital. Her mother was awake, alert, distant. They spoke little. When Emily brought up the past, Anne stared at the window and whispered, I think about him every day. When Emily pressed further, Anne said, some memories feel like stories someone told me. But I know I was there. Emily asked if she remembered writing in a journal. Anne blinked slowly. Maybe. I don't know. There are things I don't want to remember. That night, Emily returned to the attic. She read the final pages again and again. One phrase stood out. He's still there, behind the shed. I never looked back. The shed. Emily had never thought much of it growing up. It was just where tools were stored, where spiders made their homes. But now the journal gave it weight, gave it darkness. She called Eric. At first, he didn't believe her. What kind of journal? He asked. How do you know it's real? I know her handwriting, Emily said. I know the way she thinks. This is real. Eric drove over the next morning. Together they sat on the porch, the journal between them. He read for over an hour silently. When he finished, he didn't speak. He just looked out across the backyard toward the fence. Then he said, If there's even a chance this is true, we have to call the police. Emily hesitated. Do you think she meant literally behind the shed? I don't know what to think anymore. They didn't sleep that night. In the morning, they contacted Detective Sharon Lindley. She remembered the case instantly. When they explained what Emily had found, she asked to see the journal. That same afternoon, she arrived at the house. Emily handed her the notebook. And as the detective read through its pages, the weight of 15 years pressed down on everyone in the room. The silence that followed wasn't just from shock. It was the sound of something long buried beginning to surface. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the answers weren't just in her mother's journal. They were in the ground. In the places they had grown up playing, laughing, living without knowing. That shed, once just a structure in the backyard, had become a monument of silence. Now it pulsed with unease. Detective Lindley had taken the journal into evidence, but hadn't committed to anything yet. This is compelling, she told Emily and Eric, but we still need corroboration. If what she wrote is literal, we need to approach this carefully. Emily didn't wait. That night she returned to the house and walked out to the backyard with a flashlight. The shed was smaller than she remembered. Its wooden panels were warped and splintered. Its door rusted at the hinges. She opened it slowly. The inside smelled of earth and old paint. Gardening tools lined the walls. A broken lawn chair slumped in the corner. She stood there for several minutes, staring at the floor. Then she stepped outside and circled the shed. The grass behind it was overgrown. A chain-link fence stood just a few feet away, covered in vines. As she looked closer, something caught her eye. An old depression in the soil, like the ground had once been disturbed and settled again. She froze. The words from the journal repeated in her mind. He's still there, behind the shed. She took a picture. The next morning she sent it to Lindley. The detective responded within hours. I've filed for a warrant. Do not dig. We'll handle it properly. 2 days later, a forensic team arrived with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. The backyard was sealed off. The neighborhood, once quiet, was suddenly full of life again. Uniforms, whispering neighbors, journalists gathering across the street. Emily stayed inside. She couldn't watch. Eric stood at the kitchen window, arms crossed, jaw clenched. I want to believe it's not what it looks like, he muttered. But I've known for years it might be. The dogs alerted within minutes. The radar confirmed anomalies in the soil. By evening, the team had begun excavation. They worked slowly, with precision. Every inch of earth removed was sifted. At approximately 5:43 p.m., they uncovered fabric, then fragments of bone. A small shoe. Dirt-crusted, but unmistakably red and white. The kind Nathaniel wore in his second-grade school photo. The site was declared a crime scene. Emily broke down when Lindley gave her the news. We still need a positive ID, she said, but we're almost certain. Anne was still hospitalized. When informed of the discovery, she stared at the wall and said, I told you he didn't go far. No tears. No denial. Eric sat outside on the porch until sunrise. Emily didn't sleep. She lay in Nathaniel's old bed, surrounded by his drawings, and felt like she was 6 years old again, waiting for her brother to come home. But now, she knew he never would. The media descended the next morning. Headlines across Texas read, Remains found in backyard of missing boy's home. Old clips of the original 1993 press conferences resurfaced, forums exploded, theories collapsed and reformed. Everyone wanted to know how a child could go missing in a suburban neighborhood, only to be found 15 years later, just feet from his own back door. The journal became central to the investigation. Lindley reviewed every entry, comparing Anne's words to the physical evidence. One line stood out more than any other. There was shouting, then silence. I didn't mean to. Autopsy reports would take time, but initial analysis confirmed the bones were human, likely male and consistent with a child aged 7 to 9. The next step was DNA confirmation. A toothbrush of Nathaniel's, preserved in a box of childhood mementos, would provide the match. Emily gave it to the detectives without a word. For now, all they could do was wait. But the truth had started to emerge after years of darkness. And the ground beneath the shed had finally given up its secret. When the forensic team confirmed the remains belonged to Nathaniel Briggs, the silence that followed was not one of relief. It was a hollow, aching confirmation of what had long been suspected, but never spoken aloud. Emily returned to the journal. She read it again, line by line, seeking understanding. What had happened that night? What could possibly drive a mother to bury her own child and live with that truth buried, both literally and emotionally, for 15 years? The final entries held the answer. The writing had become erratic. Sentences bled into each other, emotions spilled without structure. One page read, He was yelling. I yelled louder. I don't remember what was said. Something about the door. Something about the fence. He wouldn't listen. Another. I reached out, maybe to grab him, maybe to stop him. He tripped, or I pushed. I don't know. There was a sound. I'll never forget the sound. The next pages told a grim, fragmented story. Anne described screaming. Not at Nathaniel, but at herself. She described blood, on the ground, on her hands. She described panic, not knowing what to do. Not calling 911, not running for help. Just silence. Breathless, terrible silence. Then, I carried him. He was heavy, but I didn't feel it. I opened the shed. I couldn't dig, not fast enough, so I placed him there, behind it, covered him. I told myself I'd fix it. That night, the next day, but I didn't. I never did. Anne had convinced herself it was temporary, that she'd tell someone. That she'd wake up and it wouldn't be real, but days passed, then weeks, then years, and eventually it became the story she never told. Emily showed the final entries to Lindley. The detective read them quietly, without interruption. Then she closed the journal and said, "We need to bring her in." Anne had been released from the hospital a week earlier and was staying at a rehabilitation center. When detectives arrived, she didn't resist. She didn't ask why. She simply nodded and followed them into the car. At the station, she was read her rights. When asked if she wanted an attorney, she said, "I don't know what I deserve." The interview room was cold. Anne sat with her hands folded, eyes downcast. Lindley placed the journal on the table and asked, "Is this your handwriting?" Anne nodded. "So did you write these entries?" Another nod. "Do you remember what happened to Nathaniel?" A pause. Then quietly, "Yes. Pieces. Enough." Lindley leaned forward. "Tell me about that night." Anne took a long breath. Then, for the first time in 15 years, she spoke the words aloud. "He came home late. I was angry. I told him he was careless, that I'd been worried." He yelled back. "He was never like that. But that night he was defiant. He said something about wishing he lived somewhere else, that he hated this house. It was nothing, just words. But I snapped." Her voice trembled. "I grabbed his arm. He pulled away. I think he lost his balance. His head hit the corner of the bench. There was blood. He didn't move. I froze. I kept thinking. I didn't mean to." "I just wanted him to stop shouting." Lindley asked why she hadn't called for help. Anne shook her head. "I was ashamed. I thought they'd take the others. I thought, if I just waited, it would make sense." "Did Eric know?" "No," Anne said. "He never knew." Anne signed a formal statement. The journal, combined with her verbal confession and the recovered remains, were more than enough to charge her. Emily was called in shortly after. She sat outside the room while her mother was processed. "I never hated her," she told Lindley, "but now I don't know if I ever knew her." The community reacted with a mix of fury and grief. News stations aired the story for days. The boy who vanished had never left. He had simply been hidden in the one place no one wanted to look. Eric issued a brief statement. "Nathaniel deserved truth. We failed him." Anne was denied bail. She was charged with manslaughter, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. And Emily was left with a question that would haunt her forever. Was it a moment of panic that led to tragedy? Or had that moment only revealed what had always been waiting beneath the surface? As the news of Anne's confession spread, the world around the Briggs family unraveled again, this time not with questions, but with revelations too heavy to ignore. The Houston Police Department released a statement confirming that the remains found behind the shed had been positively identified through DNA testing as those of Nathaniel Briggs. The words were final, but the wound they reopened was anything but healed. Detective Lindley reviewed the details of the confession repeatedly. Though the entries in the journal and Anne's verbal statement matched the forensic evidence, she couldn't stop thinking about one thing. Those letters Eric received back in 1993. At the time, they'd been dismissed as hoaxes. Cruel anonymous messages meant to torment a grieving family. But with new context, they now carried a weight no one had considered. The first letter, "You're being watched." The second, "Ask your wife what really happened." No fingerprints, no return address, no clear origin. Lindley pulled the original police report. The handwriting had been preserved in evidence. She requested a fresh analysis. The paper was yellowed but intact. Forensic experts scanned it using modern equipment, searching for any trace, DNA, residue, ink analysis. Then came the unexpected. Traces of adhesive consistent with archival envelopes from the 1980s. Not something likely to be found in casual household use by 1993, and faint skin oil patterns, too degraded for a clean profile, but enough to rule out Anne and Eric. It wasn't her handwriting either, so who sent them? Lindley returned to the interviews from the original investigation. Among dozens of names, one stood out: Glenn Towner. He'd been a neighbor 3 houses down at the time of Nathaniel's disappearance, a loner, quiet. Interviewed once, then cleared. But in a brief note in the case file, one officer had written, "Glenn says he saw Anne dragging something across the lawn that night." Later retracted, said he was confused. No further action. No further action. 15 years had passed, but Lindley found an address. Glenn was still in Texas, living in a small town outside Corpus Christi. She drove down unannounced. He answered the door reluctantly. Thinner now, eyes sunken, fingers twitching. When she introduced herself, he didn't invite her in, but he didn't close the door either. "I already said what I saw," Glenn muttered. "You retracted it," Lindley replied. He looked past her into the trees. "No one believed me." "I might," she said. "If you tell me again." He hesitated. Then, "It was raining. I was up late. I used to sit on my porch when I couldn't sleep. That night I saw Anne. She was dragging something, looked like a tarp, toward the shed. I didn't think much at the time, but the next day, the boy was gone." "Why didn't you push harder?" Lindley asked. Glenn laughed bitterly. "Because she wasn't the only one with secrets. I was scared they'd look into me. I didn't want attention. I thought someone else would say something. I never thought she'd... Actually," he trailed off. Lindley asked about the letters. He looked at her sharply. "You think I wrote those?" "I think someone did. Someone who knew." He didn't answer. When she left, she had no proof, no confession, just another shadow in a story already thick with them. Back in Houston, Lindley reported her findings to the district attorney. It wasn't enough to reopen another line of inquiry, but it was noted. Officially, Anne acted alone. But unofficially, questions lingered. Eric, when informed, sat for a long time without responding. Then he said, "If someone else knew and let us suffer like that, I don't know what's worse." The family buried what was left of Nathaniel in a small ceremony. No media, just Eric, Emily, Max, and a few close friends. The headstone was simple. Nathaniel Briggs, 1985, 1993. You were never forgotten. Anne was not allowed to attend. She remained in jail, awaiting trial. Emily watched the dirt fall into the grave and wondered how many others knew the truth and said nothing. The letters had resurfaced, but their author remained in the dark. And in the silence they left behind, one truth became painfully clear. Secrets never stay buried. Anne Briggs was formally charged on May 18, 2008. The indictment included multiple counts: manslaughter for the death of her son, tampering with physical evidence for the concealment and burial of his body, and obstruction of justice for misleading law enforcement and the community for over a decade. Prosecutors considered charging her with second-degree murder, but ultimately pursued manslaughter based on her confession and lack of prior intent. The public reaction was swift and divided. Some viewed Anne as a woman consumed by guilt, mentally unraveling under the weight of a single tragic mistake. Others saw a cold, manipulative mother who robbed her son not just of his life, but of dignity, truth, and the chance for justice. She had lived freely for 15 years while others searched, mourned, and suffered. The court ruled she would remain in custody until trial. In jail, Anne's demeanor was quiet. She didn't speak much to other inmates. She spent most of her time reading or staring at the wall. According to guards, she rarely slept through the night. Sometimes she whispered to herself, repeating fragments from her journal. The fence, the sound. I froze. The district attorney, Margaret Doyle, prepared the case with precision. "We have a unique opportunity," she told reporters. "This isn't just about accountability. It's about justice for a boy who was forgotten by the system. That cannot happen again." Eric and Emily were asked to testify. Both agreed. Eric had been quiet since the body was found. He'd resumed working full-time, but his colleagues said he seemed distant, like a man moving through fog. In private, he kept the journal locked away, unable to bring himself to destroy it. Emily began therapy. She told her counselor she felt like she was grieving both a brother and a mother. "I loved them both," she said, "but I can't forgive what she did. Not yet." As the trial date approached, reporters descended on the courthouse. The story had gained national attention. Networks replayed childhood photos of Nathaniel. The image of Anne being led out in cuffs appeared on every major outlet. Pundits debated motive, mental health, and the line between accident and crime. Anne's defense attorney, Joseph Kleiner, petitioned the court for a psychological evaluation. "We believe Mrs. Briggs was suffering from undiagnosed dissociative episodes, possibly a form of PTSD stemming from childhood trauma," he said. "She experienced a psychological break, and her subsequent actions were not those of a rational, premeditated mind." Prosecutors pushed back. "She buried her child, lied for 15 years, and allowed her family and this community to live in torment. That is not a momentary lapse. That is a pattern of deception." The court ordered the evaluation. 2 psychologists met with Anne. They found her detached, remorseful, but coherent. Their final report stated she understood the nature of her actions, though they were likely driven by overwhelming fear and psychological repression. "Her mental state may explain her behavior," the report read, "but it does not absolve her." The judge ruled that Anne was fit to stand trial. A pre-trial hearing determined that the journal would be admitted as evidence. The defense argued that it was a private therapeutic document, not intended for public or legal scrutiny. The prosecution countered that it contained a full confession and had been voluntarily surrendered by the family. The judge agreed with the prosecution. As the trial date was confirmed, Emily received a call from the district attorney's office. They asked if she would be willing to read a victim impact statement at sentencing should the trial lead to a conviction. She agreed, but requested that no one read it beforehand. She wanted it to be hers, raw, unfiltered, true. Anne's trial was scheduled to begin on August 3, 2008. The courtroom was expected to be full. For the first time in 15 years, the silence would be broken not by rumor or speculation, but by sworn testimony, hard evidence, and one family's reckoning with a truth that had long been buried beneath grief, guilt, and the unbearable weight of memory. And as Anne sat alone in her cell, the only sound was the scratching of her pencil on a fresh page. She had begun a new journal. But this time she wasn't the only one watching. The trial of Anne Briggs began under heavy scrutiny. From the moment jury selection started, it was clear that this would be no ordinary proceeding. News cameras swarmed the courthouse steps. True crime blogs posted daily updates. Talk shows dissected each move of the prosecution and defense. Inside the courtroom, tension clung to every word. Anne sat quietly beside her attorney, her expression unreadable. Her once dark hair now streaked with gray, her face lined. She looked more like a ghost of the woman the public remembered from old family photos. The prosecution opened with a simple statement. "This is not about intent. This is about responsibility." Anne Briggs killed her son, concealed his death, and let a lie grow into a legacy of pain. They called Detective Sharon Lindley as their first witness. She recounted the discovery of Nathaniel's remains, the state of the backyard, the journal, and Anne's eventual confession. Her testimony was calm, methodical, precise. Next came forensic experts. They described the decomposition, the age estimation, the matching dental records. They confirmed that the burial had occurred around the time of Nathaniel's disappearance. Nothing had been disturbed in all those years. Then came the journal. Each entry was projected onto a screen. Jurors followed silently as the prosecution read selected passages aloud. Anne's own words, raw and confused, gradually unraveling into guilt. She said, "I reached out, maybe to grab him, maybe to stop him. He tripped, or I pushed. I don't know." "That's not a question of memory," the prosecutor said. "That's a question of consequence." Eric testified next. His voice was steady, but his eyes revealed the weight he carried. "I trusted her," he said. "I believed she was broken by what happened, but I never imagined she was the reason it happened." When asked about their relationship after Nathaniel's disappearance, he paused. "It never recovered. We lived in the same house, but it was like she was already gone." Emily followed. Her statement was brief. "I lost my brother when I was 6, but I didn't lose my mother that day. I lost her over years, slowly, as she shut every door between us. When I found that journal, I realized I'd been raised in the aftermath of a secret, and I still don't know who she really is." The defense began its case by painting a picture of mental collapse. Psychological experts testified about Anne's emotional state at the time of the incident. They spoke of postpartum depression, unresolved trauma, and dissociative symptoms. They emphasized that the journal was not written as a confession, but as a coping mechanism. She never set out to harm her son, her attorney argued. She panicked, she broke, she made a terrible decision. But she has lived every day since with the weight of that moment. That is not the mark of a cold-blooded killer. That is the mark of a shattered mind. The defense attempted to discredit parts of the investigation. They questioned the accuracy of the timeline. They suggested that the letter writer from 1993 may have played a role, but these ideas were speculative and lacked evidence. Anne did not take the stand. When asked by the judge if she wished to speak in her defense, she declined. Closing arguments painted two stark portraits. The prosecution, a woman who took a life and lied for 15 years, letting others suffer while protecting herself. The defense, a woman destroyed by a moment of weakness, whose punishment had already lasted more than a decade in the form of silent, unrelenting guilt. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. On the count of manslaughter, guilty. On the count of tampering with evidence, guilty. On the count of obstruction of justice, guilty. Anne showed no visible reaction. She lowered her head, whispered something no one could hear, and folded her hands in her lap. Sentencing was scheduled for the following week. The judge allowed the family to prepare their victim impact statements. Emily wrote hers in one sitting. It ended with the words, "You buried my brother, but you buried all of us that day too. And we've spent 15 years trying to crawl back out." Outside the courtroom, reporters asked Eric if justice had been served. He answered simply, "Justice is never whole, but it's the start of something we were denied for too long." The verdict was in, but the story wasn't over. 1 week later, Anne Briggs stood once more before the court, this time to receive her sentence. The courtroom was quieter than it had been during the trial. Most of the media had shifted focus, and the seats were filled mostly by family, court officials, and a few community members who had followed the case for years. Anne remained silent as the judge recounted the charges and the jury's verdict. She didn't look at anyone, not Eric, not Emily, not the attorneys beside her. Her hands were still, her face expressionless. Before sentencing, the judge opened the floor for victim impact statements. Emily was called first. She stood with a folded paper in her hand, trembling only slightly. Her voice, though soft, was unwavering. "When I was 6, I asked where my brother went. I was told he disappeared. For years I believed he might come home. I kept a box of drawings we made together. I used to talk to that box at night, hoping he could hear me." She paused, breathing in deeply. "But he wasn't missing. He was here, the whole time, buried just feet from our back door. And my mother knew. She didn't just take his life, she took my childhood, my trust, and the safety I believed existed in our home." Emily folded the paper again. "I don't speak out of anger. I speak because truth matters, and because Nathaniel deserves it." She stepped down. The courtroom remained still. Eric followed. "I tried for years to understand what happened. I blamed myself for not seeing it, for not stopping it. But the truth is, I didn't know what I was living beside." He looked at Anne for the first time in months. "I believed in you. I defended you. I let you raise our other children thinking you were just broken, but you were hiding. And in hiding, you let all of us suffer." He paused, holding back tears. "Whatever sentence this court gives you, it can't undo what's been done. But I hope, for Nathaniel's sake, you carry it with full weight." The judge nodded solemnly. In sentencing, he addressed Anne directly. "You chose silence for 15 years. You chose concealment. Though your actions may not have been premeditated, they were deliberate in their aftermath. Justice delayed is not justice denied, but the delay deepens the wound. He sentenced Anne Briggs to 25 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 15. The courtroom remained hushed as she was led away. Outside, reporters asked Emily if she felt closure. "No," she said, "but I feel like I can begin." Eric filed for divorce that same week. The papers were signed without contest. Anne never responded to any letters sent afterward. Nathaniel's remains were given a final private burial, this time with a headstone and a service that truly honored him. Emily read a poem she had written. "You were the light behind the door we never opened. Now the door is gone, and you are free." Months passed. Emily began speaking publicly about childhood trauma and family violence. She partnered with local advocacy groups and shared her family's story in high schools and universities. She didn't dwell on the sensational aspects. She focused on silence, how it spreads, how it poisons, how it must be broken. Eric moved out of Houston and settled near his sister's home in Austin. Max, now a teenager, remained close to both his father and sister. He remembered almost nothing from that time, but he grew up knowing what had happened. It was never hidden again. Anne's name became a footnote in true crime books. Her story was used as a cautionary tale in training seminars for law enforcement, therapists and teachers. Signs missed, assumptions made, opportunities lost. In prison, Anne kept writing. The new journal was smaller, cleaner, its pages neat and ordered. But the content remained elusive. She never spoke about the night Nathaniel died again. Her entries were introspective, sometimes poetic, sometimes rambling. One line scribbled across an otherwise blank page stood out. "Some things are too quiet to scream. That's where I lived." But now, the silence was gone, and a boy long lost had finally been heard. Several months after Anne Briggs began serving her sentence, the past stirred again, not in courtrooms or headlines, but in a quiet box stored deep within Houston Police Department's cold case archive. Detective Sharon Lindley hadn't let the anonymous letters go. Even after the trial concluded, they gnawed at her. The journal had resolved the crime, but those messages, delivered in the days following Nathaniel's disappearance, remained unexplained. Their warnings were too pointed, their timing too precise. She requested access to the original envelopes and had them reanalyzed using updated forensic tools. Though degraded, one of the stamps revealed trace DNA, partial but viable enough to run through CODIS. The results came back with no matches in any criminal databases, but something else emerged. The adhesive compound found on the flap of one envelope was a rare type used in a limited batch of greeting cards manufactured in 1991. That narrowed the possible source. Lindley started combing through old purchase records from stores near the Briggs neighborhood. It was a long shot, but one register log listed a customer loyalty number attached to a Glenn Towner, Anne's former neighbor. She pulled his interview transcripts again. He had claimed, then retracted, witnessing Anne dragging something behind the shed. When questioned years later, he admitted fear, guilt, and silence, but not involvement. Still, Lindley couldn't ignore the pattern. She drove to Corpus Christi again, unannounced. Glenn answered the door with a resigned sigh. "I figured you'd come back," he said. "Then you know why I'm here." "I've got nothing to add," he said. "You sent those letters," Lindley replied calmly. He didn't respond immediately. Then he looked down and muttered, "I thought maybe if someone else asked the right questions, it wouldn't be on me." "Why didn't you come forward properly?" "Because I thought she didn't mean to," he said. "Because I didn't want to destroy a family, and because I knew I'd waited too long. After that, everything I did felt pointless." She studied his face. "But you watched a family suffer. You let them grieve without truth." Glenn nodded. "Yes, I did. I regret it every day." "Why the letters?" "I was trying to push Eric, trying to make him see what I saw, but I was a coward, couldn't say it to his face." Lindley considered arresting him for obstruction, but the statute of limitations on anonymous tips had long expired. There was no law against writing a letter, just a moral failure to follow through. "Do you want to make an official statement?" she asked. He hesitated. Then he nodded. In his written statement, Glenn described what he saw, a figure dragging a bundled shape across the lawn late at night, the movements hurried and uneven. He thought it was trash. Then he realized it wasn't. He saw Anne the next day, calm, quiet, composed, and he said nothing. When Lindley presented the letter to the DA's office, it was filed and noted. No charges would be pursued, but Emily was informed. She read the letter in silence. "He could have changed everything," she said. "He could have saved us from 15 years of not knowing." Lindley nodded. "Yes. But people choose fear more often than truth." Emily asked to meet Glenn. He agreed. They met in a small park near the bay. Glenn was thin, aged beyond his years. Emily was composed, direct. "You saw," she said. "You knew." "I did." "Why now?" "Because I couldn't live with the silence anymore." She stared at him for a long time. "I don't forgive you," she said. "But I don't hate you either. I just wish you'd been stronger." "I wish that too." They parted without a handshake. Back in Houston, Emily added a note to her advocacy work. "Silence doesn't just hide pain. It creates it. Every time you look away, you help it grow." The letters that once tormented Eric were finally explained, but they came too late to change what mattered most. Nathaniel's fate was sealed long before the truth found its way to the surface. Still, in the slow unraveling of the past, justice continued, not in court, but in the reckoning of conscience. Years passed. The Briggs case slowly faded from headlines, archived on crime blogs, and used in criminal justice courses. But for those who lived through it, the echoes never really stopped. Emily moved to Chicago. She earned a degree in psychology and began working with organizations that supported survivors of domestic trauma and children affected by familial abuse. Her story became a quiet part of her work, not a centerpiece, but a shadow always present. She never changed her last name. "I don't hide it," she told a reporter once, "but I don't wear it either. It's just the name I was given. It belongs to Nathaniel, too." Eric remained in Austin. He remarried quietly, years later, to a woman named Carla who understood that his grief was not something to fix, only to carry with. Max graduated high school and began college studying architecture. He designed buildings that let in light from every angle. "I don't like dark spaces," he said during a class presentation. "I think we need places that feel open even when we want to hide." One spring, Emily returned to Houston. She hadn't been back in years, not since the sentencing. She parked near the old house, boarded up now, scheduled for demolition. A family had bought the lot with plans to rebuild. The yard was overgrown, the fence sagged. But the shed was gone. The space behind it had been leveled, just earth now, soft and green. She stood there for a while, not crying, just remembering. Later that week, she visited the cemetery where Nathaniel was buried. She left a folded drawing beside his headstone, one they'd made together as kids, 2 stick figures side by side, one taller, one smiling wide, a sun in the corner. On the back she'd written, "I found you. I'm sorry it took so long. In prison, Anne Briggs was still alive, older now, frailer. She had become something of an enigma, quiet, compliant, forgotten. She refused interviews. She never appealed her sentence, but she continued writing. A prison counselor, curious, once asked her why she filled so many notebooks. "I don't know how else to keep him alive," she replied. One of those notebooks surfaced after Anne donated it to a prison writing program. It wasn't a confession, it was poetry, broken, strange, almost childlike. One entry read, "He walked in light. I followed slow, but shadows clung and wouldn't go." Another, "If silence had a sound, it would be my name." She never mentioned Nathaniel by name. When asked if she wanted visitors, Anne always declined. Emily, despite everything, never reached out again. Not to forgive, not to accuse. She said what needed saying in court. But she often wondered what went through Anne's mind in those last quiet hours before the truth came out. Did she ever plan to confess? Or would the journal have remained buried like her son, if not for one fragile discovery? The house was torn down the following year. A new structure rose in its place, modern, clean, full of windows, no shed, no echoes. A young couple moved in with their newborn daughter. They never knew what the soil had once held. Emily returned once more before the demolition. She stood where the kitchen used to be, closed her eyes. She imagined Nathaniel running through the hall, laughing, alive. That was the only memory she chose to keep. One morning, Anne was found unresponsive in her cell. Natural causes. No pain, no fanfare, no funeral. Her remains were claimed by no one. When Emily was informed, she nodded silently. "I already said goodbye," she told the officer. "A long time ago." In the end, Anne's final journal was found beneath her mattress. One last page, just 6 words, scratched in hard, uneven letters. "He was light. I was wrong." Emily never read it. She didn't need to. She had learned long ago that closure wasn't found in apologies or verdicts or prison walls. It came in living truthfully, in naming the silence, facing it, and choosing never to repeat it. The past had finally gone quiet, but its lessons echoed on. Years after the truth came to light, people still ask how a boy could disappear in plain sight, how a home, a mother, and a life could all conceal something so final, so silent for so long. But maybe the real story isn't just about Nathaniel's death. Maybe it's about what happens when the weight of silence becomes too heavy to carry, and someone finally speaks. Emily Briggs went on to write a memoir titled The Sound Behind the Silence. It became a quiet success. Not sensational, not dramatic, but thoughtful, raw, and deeply human. In it, she didn't try to explain her mother's actions. She didn't offer forgiveness or rage. She simply told the truth, the full truth, without flinching. She wrote, "There is no justice that can bring my brother back, but there is truth, and that, sometimes, is enough." Nathaniel's story lives on, not just in books or articles, but in the lives of those who learned from it, in counselors who read the signs a little sooner, in officers who listen a little harder, in children who feel heard, not overlooked. The Briggs case became more than a tragedy. It became a mirror for families, for institutions, for every person who has ever turned away from something they knew, deep down, was wrong. And it all began with one journal. One voice finally rising through the dust and darkness. 15 years of silence, undone by a daughter who refused to stop looking. There are still many who wish the ending had been different, that Nathaniel had come home alive, that Anne had spoken sooner, that someone, anyone, had opened that shed. But the reality is this. Some stories end in loss. Some questions remain unanswered. Some wounds never fully close. And still, people go on. They live. They remember. They learn. Emily now lectures around the country, speaking not just about her past, but about how families can survive the unimaginable, about how silence isn't always safe, about how pain left unspoken doesn't fade, it festers. Her voice, once buried under years of fear, is now loud, steady, and unshaken. She ends every talk with the same words. If you're holding on to a truth that hurts, that haunts, that burns, don't wait, say it. Because silence may protect for a moment, but truth heals for a lifetime. And so, the story of Nathaniel Briggs remains not just one of tragedy, but of courage, of awakening, of the quiet, powerful act of telling the truth when no one else will. To this day, his name rests on a simple headstone beneath a tree in a Houston cemetery. No flowers needed. His memory is carried forward in hearts, in actions, in the silence that was finally broken. And now, in yours. If this story moved you, if it made you think, reflect, or feel, consider subscribing. We share true stories like this one, stories that ask hard questions and offer real answers. Stories that deserve to be told, and if you want to keep going, don't stop here. Click the video on your screen to discover another unforgettable case, one that, like this, proves the truth never stays buried.